Hi, everyone. This is Lana from San Francisco Historical Society. Welcome to our online presentation, one of them honoring Black History Month. I have with me tonight Crawford Killian, Canadian historian who has studied the history of Black pioneers in the West, and he's here to talk today about the Black pioneers who came to San Francisco and their early experiences in the late 1840s and 1850s. So Crawford, welcome, and take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Lana. And hello to everyone there. Greetings from North Vancouver, British Columbia. 42 years ago, I published a book called Go Do Some Great Thing, The Black Pioneers of British Columbia. And it was a story of just that. And it very much involved people from San Francisco. The book did very well, went out of print. I brought it back in print in 2008, and it went out of print again. And now, all this long time later, it's back in print again in a third edition, which I hope you buy, but it's not important if you do, really. What I want to talk about this evening is, first of all, the general state of affairs in the United States in the 1840s and 50s that led to the Black migration to British Columbia. And then I want to talk about the situation in California, and particularly in San Francisco, and then what happened when the Blacks migrated to the North and in many cases returned to the US years later. So first of all, let me explain that in the 1840s and 50s, the United States was a lot like the United States in the 2020s. There was a sharp polarization between pro-slavery advocates and the abolitionist movement and the people in the middle who just wished it would all go away. And this got really ugly, as you no doubt know from your history courses. And in the case of California, it got complicated. But before I go into that, let me explain that the Black community across the US in the 1840s and 50s was not just sitting there waiting to be liberated. Free Blacks all over the North were gathering in what they called conventions, which were meetings to discuss the situation and to ask local governments for help in one way or another. There was a lot of intellectual ferment. And in Philadelphia, a young man named Mifflin Gibbs was growing up. He was a freeborn Black boy who had he was the son of a preacher who had died young, and his mother had supported the family as a laundress. He got very little formal education, but thanks to self-help groups, he studied a lot, he read a lot, and he became an extremely literate and articulate young man. So much so that in the 1840s, he even went on a speaking tour with Frederick Douglass himself. So he was a kind of intro to Douglass in the speeches, and he did pretty well. He toured a good part of the US, came back to Philadelphia, and realized, where do I go from here? He was a young guy. He was bright. He was articulate. He had carpentry skills, but he had no future. And Frederick Douglass's British business manager, who was a very tough lady, looked at him and gave him a dirty look and said, "What? Downhearted? Go do some great thing." And he said, "All right." He borrowed the money to get steerage passage to California in 1850. He arrived in San Francisco with 60 cents in his pocket, borrowed some carpentry tools, and went to work. In 2 years, he was the partner of a very successful boot shop in San Francisco with another Black merchant, and he was away and running. So he was, and this at this point, you have to understand something. San Francisco had gone from something like 250 people in 1846 to 1,000 in 1848. And then by the end of 1849, there were 25,000 there, thanks to the gold rush. This flood of people had come in and turned this little sleepy town, Yerba Buena, on the edge of the bay, into a booming town, which was made up of all kinds of people, but mostly white, and just a few hundred Black people. So Gibbs was one of these people, and he was succeeding against the odds. And let me explain what I mean by that. He was working hard, while in Sacramento, the whites who had just taken over California and 2/3 of Mexico after the war were passing laws making it illegal for a Black person to testify in court against a white person, and who were extremely unhappy about the presence of Black people in the state at all. In fact, one editorial in a San Francisco paper said, we'd be better off like Oregon, just forbidding them to come in at all, instead of having to impose all these requirements on them. Well, they were there, and even though there were just a few hundred of them, they were industrious, and they could buy property, they could, conduct business. So they were, by the mid 1850s, they owned $5 million worth of property. They were taxed on it. They even paid a poll tax. But if they wanted to go and vote, thanks to the poll tax, they were chased away from the polls. So this was a real racket. This was taxation without representation. Well, their own position was problematic. California had come in as a free state, but the laws passed locally said, oh, well, if you happen to come into the state and you have slaves, do something about it, maybe. And so people were coming in from the slave states with slaves. Sometimes they would rent them out and take the money they earned. Other times they would rent them out and let them save up the money to buy their own freedom or the freedom of their families. But it was all arbitrary. In fact, there were the Fugitive Slave Act meant that your owner could declare you a fugitive and you could be taken back to a slave state in the United States. This was really not a very agreeable situation. So what we find is that by the 1858, things are getting extremely ugly, and a particular case kind of triggers things. This is the case of Archie Lee. This is a young man who was brought into California by his owner, a Mississippian named Stovall. And Stovall was supposedly traveling in California for his health with a herd of cattle. And among other things, whatever he did with the cattle, he also opened a school in Sacramento. He was getting around. But Archie figured he was free, and Stovall thought he wasn't. So he tried to get him declared a fugitive. It didn't work. The Black community, while it couldn't testify in court against a white man, could still go to court for various issues. They went to court over on a habeas corpus when Archie was essentially kidnapped, and when Stovall was trying to take him back to the U.S. via Panama, and they actually had Archie pulled off the boat in the middle of San Francisco Bay, rescued at the last minute by local police. Well, the local community, which at that point must have numbered about 1,000 Black people in this big booming town of San Francisco, had a big celebration about it and considered that they had won a victory. But it was a kind of a bitter victory because they also knew that the previous year, we're now in the early months of 1858. Just a few weeks earlier, the US Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision had stated that no Black person, however freeborn for 3 generations, doesn't matter, could ever become a citizen of the United States. So the Blacks in San Francisco, who had been there after all only for 3, 4, 10 years at most, said, where do we go from here? And they thought about 3 possibilities. One was the Mexican state of Sonora. And that was not very attractive because the Americans had already taken 2/3 of Mexico. And there were all kinds of freelance operations called filibusters, whereby Americans from the US would raid Mexico or some Central American country like Nicaragua and try to take it over and turn it into an American slave state. In fact, they did pretty well in Nicaragua for a few years. So Sonora was out. They got an invitation from the then leader of Panama. And they decided, no, we've been to Panama. We went through there coming here. We don't want to go back there. And then at this point, a steamboat captain from Vancouver Island, which was then a brand new British colony, arrived with a letter, which had to have been from the governor of Vancouver Island, James Douglas. James Douglas was a complicated guy. He was an old Hudson's Bay fur trader. He had been born in Guyana in South America of a Scottish father and a Creole mother who was partly Black. He'd been educated in Scotland, shipped off to Canada, and become a member of the Hudson's Bay Company. As such, he had done very well in the West, and he was now essentially the governor of Vancouver Island, which was its own colony. Douglas had a problem. The problem was that on the mainland of British Columbia, gold had been found, and Douglas, who had been in the North American West for decades, knew what happened when gold was found. Americans would arrive in large numbers. He'd seen them take over Texas, California, the whole America, what is now the American Southwest, and he could see that the handful of English subjects he had in his little island colony could not begin to withstand an onslaught of thousands of Americans who wanted to annex this area. Now remember that it was also just a few years after an American election was fought on the slogan 54-40 or fight. That 54-40 was the southern boundary of Russian Alaska. And that meant essentially all of British Columbia. So the Americans wanted everything on the west coast of North America including Vancouver Island and the rest of British Columbia. Douglas needed ballast. He needed people in his colony who were not Americans. And he had at most a few hundred aging Scotchmen. And, they were not enough to stand up to the Americans. So when he knew that there was a Black community in San Francisco looking for a new home, he sent them an invitation. They replied with a committee who sailed north with that same sea captain, and they interviewed the governor. They looked around, they liked what they saw, and they wrote back to the community in San Francisco saying, "This is a God-sent land for the colored man." Douglas had offered them, among other things, even the right to vote. And that was a very attractive offer. He figured that if he had them, he would be doing very well with against the Americans who would soon be coming in. Now we're now in the spring of 1858. And in fact, when the Black Committee arrived in Victoria in April, they were on board a ship with hundreds of white prospectors who flooded into this little sleepy outpost at the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And it was a stopover on the way into the interior to the gold fields. Among those first people, Mifflin Gibbs was not. He stayed behind for a little while, but by June he was on his way, and he soon wrote back to his partner in San Francisco. And the letter was published in the newspaper and paid great attention to. And he said, "I am so sorry I didn't get here earlier. I could have made even more money." What was going on was an incredible real estate boom. People were clamoring for everything they could get hold of. Mifflin Gibbs had come north with a big supply of mining equipment, boots, shovels, gold pans, whatever it took. And he set up the first store the Hudson's Company had ever competed against. The Hudson's Bay Company had been essentially the corporate owner of all of Canada west of Ontario. Now, suddenly here was this, young Black guy who built his own store with his carpentry skills and went into business and soon was making a fortune. His partner came up and joined him. Meanwhile, Gibbs was buying and selling lots as the prices went out of sight. If you think San Francisco real estate is expensive now, Victoria real estate in 1858 was beyond the moon. It was crazy. And Gibbs also found that the locals he didn't much care for. He said, they're a bunch of old fuddy-duddies and they need some Yankee enterprise, which he was eager to provide. So here was Gibbs working like mad, ordering more supplies from San Francisco as fast as it could arrive, frantically trying to get hold of all the lumber he could so that he could build things, including a house for himself in a very nice neighborhood. And he made a fortune. Now, let me get back to a little bit about the background of this guy. I mentioned that he was from Philadelphia and he'd worked in Philadelphia with people like Frederick Douglass. Now, think about this. This was in a time when simply to set eyes on you meant most people in North America hated you, just for the color of your skin. He had managed, nevertheless, to get from Philadelphia to Panama, to California, and then on to Vancouver Island. And he had prospered along the way. He had his problems, but he had prospered. And he even got so wealthy that within a year or two, he could go back from Victoria all the way to Oberlin, Ohio, to meet and court and marry a young woman named Mariah, who was a student at Oberlin College. Now, this was interesting also because Oberlin College was the only school in North America that admitted Black students and Black women students as well. So she was a very bright young lady. I suspect Gibbs first met her when he was on that tour with Frederick Douglass. But he went back there and found that, yes, here he was. He was a rising young businessman, and he won her, and he brought her back to Victoria. This was quite a journey. I don't know quite how he made it or what it cost him, but it must have been a fortune, and it must have been very difficult. But they made it, and she settled in this big house that he built for her in James Bay, a very nice district of Victoria, and it bore him 5 children. Meanwhile, Gibbs was then carrying on in the business and also very active in politics and the general life of the community. What then happened was that more people began to trickle up until finally about 600 Black migrants had arrived in Victoria. Some had settled right there. Others moved straight on up the Fraser River to the gold fields along the river, and eventually all the way up to Barkerville, which at one point in the 1860s was the biggest town west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. So the Black community found itself mostly focused in Victoria and doing everything that you could imagine. Gibbs was a merchant. There were restaurant owners. There were draymen. There were farmers. There were families who settled and built big, successful farms outside Victoria. It was a remarkable time. One of the things that happened that was quite striking was that a war almost broke out between the US and Britain in the late 1850s. It was famously known as the Pig War. That was because the Hudson's Bay Company had a farm on San Juan Island in what's on the American side of the line. And somebody shot a Hudson's Bay pig. Oh dear, that got into a big problem. And before they knew it, the Americans had landed a military force on the island. So the British, based in Victoria, had to put some of their own Marines on the island. And the last thing that the British wanted was a war with the Americans on the far side of North America, where the British would be hopelessly defeated. And they also knew that they were completely vulnerable to an American takeover of Victoria. So what to do? Well, one thing they did was to form a militia unit, which was known as the African Rifles. The Black community decided if we're going to live here, we should be able to defend this place. And they formed a company of militia. And from the one photo we have of them that survives, they were as military looking as any group of the time, dressed in very standard dark blue uniforms. They were trained by a Royal Navy Marine who came ashore to drill them in marching and so forth. And they made quite an impressive military appearance. Fortunately, the war threat was avoided. And as a small sort of footnote, the officer in charge of the Americans was a certain Colonel Pickett, who a few years later would lead Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So that was a brief glimpse into where he was going. So once the war got going in the U.S. and the Civil War really got ugly, the Black community in San Francisco continued to watch it with great interest. And there was a certain amount of intrigue by Confederate sympathizers among the Americans in Victoria. It never amounted to very much. There were some, attempted ways to, embarrass the Union side, but nothing really happened. But the Black community in Victoria continued to keep their community in San Francisco and elsewhere in the US aware of what was going on. And they reported on their own problems. And they did have problems. What they found was that while the governor had been very welcoming to them and had promised them the vote, there were some legal intricacies that he hadn't quite mentioned. And so when they did vote, it turned into a bit of a political uproar because they voted for Governor Douglas and his party, while the reformers figured that this was a rigged election, and they got very upset with the Black people. It was not a secret ballot. You marched up to the polling place and you told them who you were voting for, and they marked it down, and everyone knew who voted for. So the Black community was being treated as essentially, they were regarded as political pawns of the establishment, and this led to some anger and ill feeling. Nevertheless, Gibbs, a few years later, after a couple of tries, succeeded in becoming elected to the Victoria City Council. And he did quite well there. He was, in fact, the chair of the council's budget committee, and the city was in some financial trouble, and he managed to get everything squared away and evened out the city's budget. So that made him pretty popular. He then went off. He resigned from he took a leave of absence from the council and went off to what was then known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, what we now know as Haida Gwaii, way up north, to develop a coal mine that had been developed there or found there. And he built the first railway in the province. It was more of a tramway. It was a wooden rail system for getting coal from the mine down to tidewater to load into ships. And it took him a couple of years to do it. He was working with a mixed crew of whites, blacks, indigenous people, who all got along fairly well. And after 2 years, he finally got it succeeded, went back to Victoria and wrapped up his affairs. It was now 1867 or so, and he had very little to hold him in British Columbia. His wife had already gone back to Oberlin with their children. And sometimes I think she must have had her reasons, because he must have been a tough guy to live with. He was so on fire with all kinds of activities. He was ready for a battle anytime. He once got into a fist fight in the theater because he and his wife had been harassed by whites who didn't think that they belonged in the dress circle. So she had gone back to Oberlin. He followed her back there for a while, but the marriage was clearly over. He then went off into the Reconstruction South and settled in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he was elected a judge, did very well. He also worked as a very loyal and effective political operative among the Black community for the Republican Party, which was then, of course, the party of Black people. And in his great old age, as a political reward for this, he was actually offered a job as a US consul in Madagascar. So at the turn of the century, in his 70s, he went off to Madagascar for a couple of years, came back, and I don't blame him. It was a tough assignment. Wrote his autobiography, self-published it, and went back to Little Rock and started a bank for the Black community. It did very well until it didn't. By now he was getting into his 80s and he was losing a step or two. But the bank was closed down and affairs were wrapped up. And he died in 1915 at the age of about 92, I guess. And he was probably the richest Black man in the United States at the time. He had been back to Victoria at least once and been welcomed as one of the old founding fathers. And it was quite a career in which San Francisco had been both a destination and a stepping stone for a very remarkable man. I'm not sure what much else I can add to this, except to say that it was of our history, both Canadian and American, that we don't know much about. We think of the gold rush and then we think of the Civil War. We don't think of the things that connected them. We don't think of the politics that triggered all the violence of the 1850s and 60s, all the bigotry that we are still living with. And we don't realize that, among other things, one result of the Black communities leaving San Francisco was that the country of Canada actually exists. Because even though there were very few people who were part of that Black community, they did provide some ballast for James Douglas. When Americans did begin to look a little possessive, it didn't go anywhere. And there was one little incident called Ned McGowan's War, where it really looked as if the American prospectors might take over the gold country until the British troops showed up. And then everyone was all very nice. And without that ballast, the Americans might have taken over Western Canada to 54-40. And it would be a very different world that we would live in. So I had the incredible opportunity to learn about this story many years ago, and then to write about it and publish it, and then to find, and I wasn't surprised, that I had only scratched the surface. There was a lot more to the history of the Black people in British Columbia, and in California that I hadn't touched, and that I hope that future historians will pay close attention to as they write more about this remarkable episode in our country's history. Thank you for your attention. I've very much enjoyed talking with you.
Crawford, thank you. That was marvelous. You've added incredible depth and detail to a story that I felt I knew a lot about, but I see I didn't. And you clearly filled a gap in the history of Black Americans in the West and Black pioneers. And I think your presentation tonight has been a great addition to our celebration of Black History Month. So before I let you go, one question: where can people buy your book?
I would suggest either a good local independent bookstore, which would be happy to order it from Canada, or go to Amazon, where you could find it, I think, pretty easily, either as a hard copy or as an ebook.
Okay, great. And once again, the title is Go Do Some Great Thing.
The Black Pioneers of British Columbia.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye, Crawford.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.